Hey there everybody, Mural Joe here. So this is the stencil that I used, and you can see it looks like some kind of a mutated fish, but the shape of the stencil is not so important. It could be many different shapes. What I tried to do was, and I made this in my friend Scott's wood shop with his band saw. I just cut this out of a thin sheet of plywood. And what's important about it is that I just took all the different kinds of curves that I wanted to use in my flames and just included them on the perimeter of this shape. Now you can see that I have it tapered on the edge, so you can see that this side I sanded down so that I have this shape, and I just did that with a belt sander. And then on this side it's flat. So what that allows me to do is have harder edges if I hold the stencil this way and spray over it, versus if I do it this way, it puts distance between the edge of the stencil and the body of the car so that I get a foggier edge, and sometimes that foggy edge looks more realistic because it creates a nice glow. So I can use both of those. Now when I'm doing fire, it has both. There are some very sharp edges and there are some very soft edges, so I can just flip this over to get either one of those. And then also, in flipping it over, I get a different shape than if it's this way, so that I don't end up with as much repeating patterns, because you really can see those if you make the mistake of holding it in the same place, airbrushing, and then doing it up here and then doing it over here, and you get the same thing. I want to avoid doing anything more than a couple times with it in the same direction. So I'll flip it, I'll go this way, and then I'll come over here and go this way. Then I'll come over here and go this way. And I can build shapes. Let me show you my sample. This was a sample that I generated before we started this job so that my customer could see it. But when I'm building a smaller shape like this, I might just take a curve here and say, oh, I'll just kind of put this here, and then I'll just spray that little section of it, then I'll move it over and then do this side. And I might use the same curve to build one shape. Now let me show you the airbrush that I used. This is the generic version, I'm going to say generic even though a real brand did make it, of the Iwata Revolution TR2, I think it's called. And that would be the expensive version that I think would be a good buy. I especially like the way this feels having it on the side, because I can put my hand over this trigger, and this is a dual action airbrush where the trigger affects airflow and paint flow. And so I pull it back. That initial pull back lets air come out of the airbrush, and then as I go further, it starts to allow paint to come out, and the further I pull it, the more paint it allows. And this is made by a company called Steelman that I had never even heard of. I just found it on Amazon. And so I was like, oh, sure, I'll just try the generic version of that Iwata, because it was like 80 bucks versus 200 bucks. But I do find with using cheaper tools, a lot of times they just don't last as long, although they will perform as well initially. And that may be the case with this. I haven't used it for a super long time, but I did like the way it performed. I can move this cup that's on here. I put the paint in here, and this has a cap on it, and that's really important to use during the job because you do not want to splash your surface with wet paint. That is a total bummer when you've just done 5 layers of paint and then you accidentally move too quick and it splashes. So that cap is important. But I can pour it in there, and if I'm doing the hood of the car, standing over it, then I slide it up this way, and then I don't have to worry about the angle. And then if I'm doing clouds on a ceiling or a lower part of the car on the side, I do this. So this is different than this kind of airbrush. And my buddy Mark McCall just sent me this from Australia. That was pretty fun. And this airbrush works really well. Great for smaller detail. You can see that this just has the cup on the top and you can't rotate it. It works really well at this angle, and it's very responsive. So where this might not send the paint out as instantly and as reactive when you pull the trigger because it's coming down through the side and then out. This one immediately has a great response with the paint, but smaller amounts with that little cup. And if you put a big cup on top of one of those, it gets a little bit squirrely as it's tipping around while you're handling the gun. This cup being on the side is nice because it's not up on top tipping around, and so I feel like I have better control. And I like pulling that trigger. If this finger gets tired, I can pull it with this finger. If that finger gets tired, I can pull it with this finger. I can use two hands with this because I have shaky hands, and it's nice to be able to do two hands a lot of the time so I can get steadier lines when I'm freehanding. Now this is a part that comes with it that I didn't even remember to use on this job. But this is fun because it's a moisture trap, and it screws on between the gun and the hose, and it also gives you a little handle. And this is on the Iwata version also. And you can use that as a handle, and it collects a lot of the water that might get in your line. Now that's important because the water gets in your gun and spits out and creates some marks that you don't want while you're working with non-water-based paint. The paint can clog a lot of different areas inside this gun, but the good news is that you can disassemble the whole thing and clean it out. But solvent-based paint doesn't clog nearly as badly because when you're working with solvents, they will dissolve even the dry paint that starts to collect on the needle. So as long as you add enough of the reducer to the paint that you're using and just use the appropriate recommended reducer, there are a lot of different lines of paint out there, and so you just want to use the appropriate reducer. And there's a lot of different opinions on what paints will perform better in an airbrush, and I honestly don't know. But you want to be able to take your gun apart and clean it. And if you've ever used your gun with water-based paint, which I had some acrylic paint in here, I have to clean that really thoroughly before I switch to solvent because the remnants of that acrylic paint will booger up inside of the gun and clog everything. You want it to be really clean before you use solvent-based paint in there. If it's really clean, it should perform for you just fine. I liked this cheaper version, but when I left it in water earlier on, it did rust inside, and so that shows it's probably not made out of the most expensive steels, but the performance was good. I like to keep a little brush handy because when I'm cleaning my airbrush, it's nice to be able to put this inside of the cup of the airbrush and get any little debris. If I'm switching to another color, you know, I'll put thinner in there and then I'll clean it out and dump it out, then I'll put more in. I'll also use the bristles of this brush to clean out the needle like this, you know, if it gets gummed up. And since it's solvent-based, it cleans off pretty easy when I just dab it with that solvent, that thinner. Now I want to show you this air compressor that I used initially, and that was this guy. And for just one little airbrush, this looks like it's more than enough power. It's got 4 cylinders, and it does indeed have a lot of power. But this is an oilless air compressor, and it overheated on me pretty quickly. So I made it through maybe a quarter of a day's work before this automatically turned off because it was too hot. That was very disappointing. So I recommend not using an oilless air compressor, but maybe using an airbrush compressor that is specified for airbrush work and uses oil. And depending on who makes it, they'll specify the kind of oil that they put in those. And I do think that you get what you pay for with these things, because I was excited about a real low price deal. I was like, sure, I'm going to test that out and see if it works. It didn't work good. But it did have power, and if you were doing a short job, I'd have no complaints because it wouldn't have overheated on me then. Now you can see on this compressor, this is a separate unit that you could interchange and put on different compressors. So this is what you call the regulator, and that with this dial you can turn to letting more pressure get to your airbrush, and if I turn it counterclockwise, then it turns down the amount of pressure that's allowed to get through to your airbrush. And that you can read on the dial, and it'll show you what your pressure is. And a normal amount to run it at is probably between 40 and 60 psi. And I think I could do my technique with any of those. I tend to prefer higher pressure because I like to work fast and get a lot done, and you can really get caught up in tiny details. So then you can see right after the regulator, it goes to this little guy. So this could run 2 airbrushes because I could put a hose on each of these, but I only have this one hooked up to what's called a quick release. And so that's nice. You want to use the right fittings because they make different sizes. So this allows me to quickly go into one compressor, and if your airbrush compressor fails, as this one did, then I was able to just take this out and put it into another one very quickly that was there at the auto body shop. And so it's nice to have this quick release, but not completely necessary. Then this down here usually comes along with the regulator, and that is a moisture trap. This is another moisture trap, just like the one that I showed you was attached to the airbrush at the handle. This is the same thing that's just attached to the compressor itself. Those are real important. As I said before, it's a bummer when water spits out of your airbrush onto the surface. And the reason water is in there is because condensation happens inside of the tank and then finds its way through your hose. The color gets a little bit brighter when you put that clear coat on, and it's not as powdery and peachy looking. It becomes more of the brilliant orange that you want once you get that clear coat on. But I recommend seeing it in your bright light that you want it to look good in, because sometimes being in a closed room can give you a different look, and you might be under the impression that those flames are a certain shade of orange, and then when you get it out into the sunlight, it's too yellow. So in order to get the color to where you want it to be, I recommend holding it under the light that you want it to look good in, and being careful to make sure that that color is where you want it before you clear coat it. Now, I had a tack cloth handy the whole time because I was having a lot of overspray stick to my surface, and once I paint over that overspray, it'll just glue it right to the surface. So I want to keep a tack cloth handy, and after my areas have dried, and they do dry quickly, I can just dust them off with that tack cloth, or with, you could try other kinds of soft cloth, but a tack cloth doesn't leave any lint on the surface. This sanded surface, I found, collected overspray a lot worse than anything that would have been freshly painted. So it's a lot easier to paint these flames without the issues of overspray sticking to other areas if it's just a freshly painted surface. That was a real difficulty, keeping that overspray off of everything. And so I recommend doing this on a freshly painted base coat so that you have an easier time managing the overspray sticking to it.